The empath's silence is not what the avoidant prepared for. They built their entire relational strategy around the assumption that someone would always be there, absorbing their distance, tolerating their withdrawal, providing emotional constancy while they maintained emotional control. When the empath finally stops offering what they once gave so freely, when the well of patience runs dry and the reaching stops, the avoidant experiences something they never anticipated, the complete dissolution of the dynamic that allowed them to function. This is not simple loneliness or regret. This is structural collapse, the crumbling of an entire psychological framework that depended on the empath's presence to remain stable, the shattering of the parasitic equilibrium. The relationship between avoidant and empath operates as an unacknowledged agreement where one person provides all the emotional labor while the other maintains all the emotional distance. The avoidant convinces themselves this arrangement is balance, that their independence is a form of strength rather than extraction, but when the empath withdraws into silence, the true nature of this equilibrium becomes undeniable. The avoidant was not independent, but dependent on someone else's capacity to tolerate their unavailability. They were not self-sufficient, but rather sustained by another person's willingness to accept breadcrumbs while providing banquets. The empath's silence removes the foundation upon which the avoidant built their sense of self. Without someone to push away, their autonomy feels empty. Without someone absorbing their coldness, their detachment feels purposeless. Without someone maintaining connection despite their withdrawal, their isolation transforms from choice into consequence. This realization triggers a psychological crisis because it exposes the avoidant's carefully constructed identity as fundamentally false. They were never the strong, independent figure they imagined themselves to be. They were someone who needed another person to tolerate their dysfunction in order to avoid confronting it themselves. The grief for the fantasy they destroyed. What collapses the avoidant most profoundly is not the loss of the person but the loss of who that person allowed them to be. The empath provided something irreplaceable, unconditional presence that asked for nothing the avoidant was capable of giving. This created a fantasy where the avoidant could be emotionally unavailable without consequence, where they could withdraw without abandonment, where they could be fundamentally inadequate in relationship while still being chosen. The empath's silence destroys this fantasy completely. It reveals that there were limits to tolerance, boundaries to patience, and consequences to consistent emotional neglect. The avoidant must now confront that they were not cherished despite their flaws but rather enabled because of the empath's own wounds. The person who stayed was not staying because the avoidant was worth the pain, but because the empath did not yet value themselves enough to leave. This truth is devastating. It means every moment of acceptance was not proof of the avoidant's worthiness, but evidence of the empath's depleted self-regard. The collapse happens when the avoidant recognizes they destroyed the one person who made their dysfunction livable, who transformed their emotional unavailability into something that could almost resemble a relationship. The confrontation with unsustainable emptiness. When the empath falls silent, the avoidant is left alone with the emptiness they spent years avoiding. There is no longer someone else's emotions to regulate against, no longer someone else's needs to position themselves in opposition to, no longer someone else's presence to take for granted while maintaining distance. The silence forces them into direct contact with the void at their center, the profound inability to connect that they mask through strategic withdrawal. This emptiness is unbearable, not because it is new, but because it was always there, hidden beneath the performance of independence. The avoidant collapses under the weight of recognizing that their entire relational pattern was not strength but avoidance of this exact moment. They pushed away the one person willing to stay because staying required vulnerability they could not access. They devalued genuine care because receiving it demanded they acknowledge their own worthiness. They maintained distance because closeness exposed the terrifying truth that they do not know how to be intimate even when they desperately want to be. The empath's silence is the mirror that reflects this truth without mercy. There is no one left to blame, no one left to push against, no one left to make the avoidant feel whole through their persistent attempts at connection. What remains is the stark reality that the avoidant destroyed their own chance at the love they claimed not to want, but secretly needed more than they could ever admit. The collapse is complete because there is nowhere left to hide from themselves.